Thank you so much. I'd just like to introduce Advocate Hermione Cronje, who will now be taking the next session.
Good morning, Ms. Cronje. Would you kindly state your full name for the record?
I'm Hermione Cronje.
Miss Advocate, I'll call you Ms. Cronje. The whole thing going on about this whole advocating.
Completely fine.
You are here to speak about the failure to investigate economic crimes more broadly, not just obviously limited to jobs. But can you briefly tell us about your background and why it is that you can speak with authority to this subject?
I can tell you about my background, and then you can draw your own conclusions about what authority I have to speak on any of these topics. My first job out of university was as a member of the Select Committee on Justice in Parliament, where I had the privilege of doing research on important pieces of legislation, the Prevention of Organized Crime Act, the National Prosecuting Authority Act, and the International Cooperation in Criminal Matters Act. So I had the opportunity to do research around the world and make sure that we put before parliamentarians what we considered best practices. They obviously adopted the law, so it's all their responsibility. I then was working for Bulelani Nuka at the time, and he, in 1998, was appointed as the first National Director of Public Prosecutions. So I consider myself the first employee of the National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa, because he asked me to come up to Pretoria to help him set up the office. So I worked as his PA for a year, and basically was involved in setting up the machinery of the National Prosecuting Authority. So I was the fly on the wall, taking minutes of the first meetings of all the old Attorney Generals, who now for the first time had this pass as the National Director of Public Prosecutions. I was involved in setting up with him, obviously as the scribe and the just research on institutions of the NPA. So the investigating directorates at the time into organized crime, commercial crime, then setting up the Scorpions shortly thereafter. So I had quite a very nice exposure to the foundations of these institutions as a young lawyer at the time. I then decided I better get on with my own career. So I joined, also again as one of the first employees to Willie Hofmeyr in the Asset Forfeiture Unit in about 2000. And that's where I stayed for the next 10 years in asset forfeiture, prosecuting various asset forfeiture cases, sort of setting up the Asset Forfeiture Unit, taking the first cases to court, developing the jurisprudence, and I'm only going to tell you about the things I take credit for. You'll discover the other things as we go along. But I do take credit for the asset forfeiture proceedings that resulted in the forfeiture of 30 million rand from Shabir Sheikh as a result of the Sheikh prosecution. And so I was certainly involved with that prosecution as an asset forfeiture specialist. I then left the NPA in, as part of the NPA, I left to study a year at Harvard University, and then returned and left the NPA to join the bar. But whilst at the bar, I started working as a consultant for the STAR initiative. The STAR initiative is the Stolen Assets Recovery Initiative. It's a joint project of the United Nations, the UNODC, and the World Bank. And as part of that initiative, I started out doing sort of institutional capacity building work in Namibia, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda. At the moment, I'm doing quite a bit of work with Nigeria, the Ukraine, Moldova, and I'm about to start a project with Guatemala. And these projects are all looking at mainly asset recovery institutions and looking at how effective ways of making sure that certainly the proceeds of corruption is repatriated to the country of origin. I did a little booklet for the UN last year on management of seized and confiscated assets. And it was launched at the GFAR meeting in December in Washington, D.C. last year. GFAR is the global Forum for Asset Recovery, the Global Forum on Asset Recovery. And out of that, I have now quite a few engagements to advise on what to do with the proceeds of crime and how to ensure repatriation of the proceeds of crime so that they can benefit the communities that were initially deprived of that income. So, and then on the side, I have my practice at the bar in Cape Town and my 2 children. Also keep me busy.
Thank you. That's very comprehensive. Thank you. I appreciate that. You would have heard evidence laid here and various narratives about the role of private actors in circumventing UN sanctions or otherwise acting contrary to the rule of law. My first question to you is twofold. A, whether there have been challenges in investigating international economic crimes, and if so, whether what those challenges have been. By international economic crimes, I'm not only focusing on actors that are not South African, I'm actually including in the South African actors. For example, what used to be now Absa Bank was quite implicated. So it's actors like that that I also have in mind.
So it's an extremely broad question, so I'm going to take the liberty of answering it in the way that I can reasonably and sensibly comment on it and helpfully comment on it. So for me, it's easier to talk about domestic accountability, so accountability of South African individuals and entities under South African laws by South African criminal justice players. And then there is the accountability that is achievable internationally at the hands of, or with the cooperation of international, firstly, instruments like the UN Convention on Corruption, the OECD Convention on Bribery, and even the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act. So those instruments and what opportunities for accountability they offer, not necessarily offer international organizations, but actually offer South African institutions to cooperate with other bodies in the international arena. And then, so while there's the domestic situation and the foreign, there's also pre-1994 and post-1994. And this would be that opportunity for me to just pause and mention that it is now 30 years since our final constitution has come into effect. So for me, that's a big divide, the before and after legal regime in South Africa. And I'm more qualified, if I'm qualified at all, to speak post-1994 than I am to speak about pre-1994. But certainly what the book Apartheid, Guns and Money has revealed to me, and there's another book, Our Turn to Eat, has revealed to me about Kenya, that these institutional relationships, and in the book, I think Leni van Vuren talks about the deep state, but also these deep connections and relationships. They've endured and have been in existence for long before 1994. So I think that a first step in accountability there is just revealing what happened and demonstrating to the world what happened then. And I know the world has no appetite for going that far back. We can barely deal with what's going on right now. But without understanding how what's happening now is embedded in very important structures. And actually, if we don't address them going back, our hope for the future being any different, no matter who we put in those positions, is minimal. So my big mouthful. To come back to your question on what accountability is.
Have there been challenges? Have you encountered any difficulties?
So again, now I have to be careful about being governed by the NPA Act's requirements that what is discovered and lent under the NPA is NPA property. But I can speak of things that are in the public domain, and they have certainly been huge challenges. And I can also say that these are very similar challenges being experienced in Tanzania, Kenya, Nigeria. There's obviously the challenge of political will. Everybody knows that unless those in power have the appetite to permit accountability happening, there's going to be a huge challenge. So I think so certainly international organizations attempt to do is firstly to make sure the legal framework is in place to address the challenge of international economic crime. So I rattled off a few instruments, and I think that the instruments, the legal instruments, are certainly there. The legal framework in South Africa, I would almost say, is second to none. You know, we are signatories to UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and as part of UNCAC, we are reviewed to see if our our legal framework is up to standard, if we have the right institutions in place, and if they are actually, those institutions are doing what they are empowered to do. And our reports are online for anyone to read. How South African institutions are assessed by their peers in other countries is there for you all to read. Similarly, the OECD, South Africa is a partner member of the OECD. So it's not a full member, but it's a partner member, and it is a signatory to the Convention Against Bribery. And again, there it can participate in the structures of the OECD, where prosecutors from member countries come together and look at international economic crime, mostly corruption, but just economic crime in general cases, and they share ideas. And South Africa in 2016 had a peer review, and I wanted to read from just the summary of how South Africa does, because my language is often a lot more colorful, but I was surprised that an international instrument body like this, they were prepared to just say how unsatisfactory South Africa's efforts are to hold accountable South Africans involved in corruption in South Africa, but also South Africans involved in corruption in other parts of Africa, which is a significant trend, which we are shirking our responsibility to the rest of Africa in terms of accountability. So I would say firstly, we have the legal framework. We can utilize the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that also gives us the US, access to US financial information, because the company who's bribing in South Africa or in Africa is using US institutions, financial institutions, to perpetrate those offenses. So the US certainly is very aggressive in holding accountability there. The UK is now fastly coming on board in terms of ensuring accountability for bribery of UK companies elsewhere in the world, including South Africa, which is where the focus on the lawyers that have been involved in state capture investigations. That's where the push is coming from, to hold them accountable. But also, just the mutual legal assistance framework has come a long way. It used to be very hard to get information, let's say in the context of the arms deal investigations, to ask a Swiss bank, so we see money going into an account here, or coming from an account to a South African account. Who is the account holder, and can you send the information so that we can prove that that is a sort of conduit account coming from a UK arms manufacturer or French arms manufacturer? it used to be very difficult to do that when I first started prosecuting cases like that. Things have progressed so much in terms of mutual legal cooperation, partly because the world has shrunk because of electronic communication and so on, but people also, prosecutors now spend a lot more time in international fora meeting and talking about cases. So, in fact, it's now the opposite problem. The problem, there is this drive to cooperate, and there's this deafening silence on this side of the, at the GFAR meeting in Washington. The Swiss were up there trying to clean up their act because they have this reputation across the world of traditionally having been a safe haven for dirty money. And so they are on a mission to rehabilitate their image. And I'm not saying you have to buy all of that, whether it's genuine or not. I'm saying you have to take them up on the offers and see how far you can go, and then you expose whether it's genuine or not. But certainly, the Swiss have now said to the whole world that if you have evidence of corruption at a very basic level, reason to suspect that there's been corruption, and you have reason to believe that money sitting in a Swiss bank account is the proceeds of that corruption, there are legal instruments which we can call upon that are fairly informal, not the old, complicated, draconian, hard-to-do stuff. Before you used to have to give them a request in 5 different languages, in print, and all sorts of bureaucratic difficulties. Now, you send an email and you set out your grounds and you say this is the bank account. They then do their own investigation, and if they believe there's merit, and they will cooperate. They will then hold your hand and say, these are the documents you need to submit, this is the format in which you must make the request. So I think that there is out there not just the legal framework, but there's also in the law enforcement community the commitment to cooperate. So where's the problem? I think the problem is at the domestic level, certainly not on a legal framework basis, because we have all the laws in place. We have institutional capacity problems. So I've mentioned everywhere in the world there is the issue of political will. I think we park that for the moment, and let's assume that there's not going to be the political will, because that's often the case. When the investigation gets close to the people in power, the political will drains away. And so you have to rely and fall back on the institutions and the laws and civil society. And I think that what we have to focus on is what empowers civil society to demand this kind of accountability, what empowers our institutions to be able to withstand the pressure, the inevitable pressure, happens in every country. But what is going to give us the institutional capacity to withstand that pressure? And obviously, do we have the adequate legal framework? And I would suggest that we certainly struggle at the level of institutional capacity at the moment. And we have the legal framework, so it's a resource issue, as well as a capacity in the sense of skill and capacity, because it is a very complicated arena. And my experience in the last few years is businesses who find themselves at the receiving end of a criminal indictment will spend and have budgeted for, usually, like the drug dealers do. They budget for legal fees and for their engagements with the law. They are completely prepared. So I bet you in the wake of any of the major scandals, Steinhoff or any of those, there will already be employed a team of international lawyers in every jurisdiction, a team of forensic accountants, just teams of people who can put together the volume and manage it. I mean, I'm trying to assist, my little speciality niche now at the bar is trying to get complainants to make a complaint to the authorities to help them to prosecute various crimes, mostly of a financial nature. And the big challenge is the volume and bulk of information, the complexity of the information, and the ability to reduce the complex into something that investigators, prosecutors, judges, all of us can just understand at a simple level.
I want to take you to task a little bit. So you divided your presentation into effectively the domestic post-1994 and the international. That's fine. I understand the difficulty that one would have in organizations such as the NPA in a country called South Africa that no one quite frankly cares about. And from a global north point of view, right? That's fine. Now, you said you're more interested in speaking to the post-1994 stuff. The word constitution was brought up by you for the first time today, thanks. You also said that there is no political will in sometimes the investigation or taking on even some of these economic crimes. My question is, so I'm sure you're familiar with section 1779 of the Constitution, which deals with the NPA. 1794 requires the NPA to act independently. So in the light of section 1794, why is political will even relevant?
That's a very good question, and that brings me to where I would say the first area of activism should be to fix the problem we find ourselves in at the moment. You're absolutely correct. The Constitution and the NPA Act, and as every prosecutor before becoming a prosecutor swears an oath to act without fear, favor, or prejudice and independently. So why do we have this problem? Well, there are many ways to skin a cat. If you would like to see as an end result that cat not bothering you anymore. And obviously, laws are good, institutions are good, but at the end of the day, you have to put human beings into those positions. And I'm not saying that anything about any particular human being who has been in any particular position. I'm saying that if you are up against, and this is inevitably what you become up against, powerful, whether it's in business or in government, players who have resources, who have networks, and who have some authority and control over your access to resources. These people will inevitably feel the pressure. Now, I don't think we'll solve that problem ever, anywhere in the world. I've seen it, the most upstanding people either have to fold or become corrupted or just become ineffective because it's very hard to stand up against this. You need the whole institution to support them. But so the best we can do is make sure that we have a way of selecting the best people to fill those positions. So I think my number one issue is with how the National Director of Public Prosecutions is appointed at the moment. So the very same Constitution we all love and respect gives that power to the President. The President appoints the National Director of Public Prosecutions. The courts have recently said, well, he must act rationally when he does so, and he certainly shouldn't act for ulterior purposes. He needs to act in the best interest of the country, not his own personal interest when he does so. But it seems to me that it would be more appropriate. We have a moment now, depending on what the Constitutional Court does, of again, I think your little introductory booklet says we've had 6 or 7 national directors of public prosecution since I first joined the office, and thought we would have one every 10 years, because that's the term prescribed in the Constitution. We need to agitate, certainly as civil society, but everywhere, that the appointment of a National Director of Public Prosecutions should happen in much the way judges of the High Court are currently appointed, by a slightly more independent process. And I don't think it should be necessarily by Parliament, because that still politicizes the process. So a body where the profession and the politicians and other civil society organizations have a role in deciding We have the laws, we have the institutions, we're just looking for the right person to lead it now. That still won't guarantee that you don't have someone who doesn't sort of get diverted along the way, but your chances are much better. So that's one area where I think why we are struggling. But the other areas is that person is very powerful. The National Director of Public Prosecutions and the National Commissioner of Police are extremely powerful positions in terms of the culture and the ethos in those organizations. So I think our second problem is that we have real capacity problems at the moment to tackle any serious investigation. And it's not just me saying that. Our current structure for dealing with corruption in South Africa is the ACTT, the Anti-Corruption Act. Task team, the Anti-Corruption Task Team is what ACT stands for. And it's made up of the NPA, the Hawks, the SIU, the Auditor General's Office, the FIC, all the players in investigating crime. And certainly, before I left the NPA, I was a member, and our targets then were we had to arrest and prosecute and forfeit the assets of a certain number of individuals. I forget the exact targets. But because I was asset forfeiture, my interest was in players that had benefited to the tune of 5 million or more. Because in the prosecution, and again, apparently the statistics out of the prosecution is that they have a success rate in prosecutions of 90-odd%. I shudder to say 98%. I mean, do we all feel like our various complaints to the criminal justice system has been addressed to the tune of a 98% success rate? And the reason is cases disappear long before they are ever prosecuted. And when they say success, that could mean someone taking a plea bargain to not go to jail on much lesser charges than the Act warrants. So we have a dismal record at the moment of prosecuting. In Parliament last year, ACTT went before Parliament to account. How are we doing? The statistics are there for you all to read. The record is dismal. Nobody's gone to jail because we like to do plea bargains. Because on the other side, we have aggressive lawyers pointing out to us all the reasons why we won't succeed. And we don't even have our own capacity to analyze. And we say, okay, well, let's just agree. At least we'll have finalized another case, even if it's without a prison sentence or recovery of the proceeds of the crime. But at least it's another case, tick, finalized.
Can I bring you back a little bit to effectively the running theme of this tribunal? I'm not sure if you're aware, but I am instructed that Volkskas, which is the predecessor of Absa Bank, was the bank at which Armscore's account was held. That's fine. My question, so just bank that. Mm-hmm. Yesterday, Mr. Nsebenzo was here to speak about the shortcomings of the TRC in investigating some of these complex economic crimes. And he also spoke about the recommendations of the TRC, and his parting words were that we need to retable the recommendations of the TRC. Question is, what has the NPA done post-1994, because the TRC was post-1994 and those recommendations are post-1994. What has the NPA done, bearing in mind Section 179 of the Constitution, to, at the very least, investigate the cases that were recommended to it? For example, this Volkskas Bank, which is now Absa Bank. Where have you gone with that? Do you know? If you don't know, you don't know. If you can't speak to it, you can't speak to it. But I thought
I'm very fortunate to now not be in the NPA anymore and have to account for what the NPA does or doesn't do. But I want to comment more generally that obviously there are legal constraints And in the last few years, the NPA's common refrain when asked, why are you not prosecuting X, Y, or Z, is saying, well, we're waiting for the docket to arrive. We're waiting for the police to investigate and refer for prosecution, and then that's when we become active. We can't go of our own initiative. We did that when the Scorpions were in existence. The Scorpions are no longer in existence. So we are unable to initiate that kind of prosecution. So the NPA will probably say that we have not been but their response to the TRC recommendations will be the same as their response has been to the other human rights violations that have been referred. It's ongoing, it's difficult, it's been a long time, but I certainly feel that there's no reason not to look into those, and if there's merit in a prosecution, to do those prosecutions. You know, everywhere in the world, countries are doing things that go back many years if they have a specific interest. And I really think there's nothing stopping us from setting up a structure to properly probe those kinds of...
That leads nicely into my next question. And I'm just trying to make sense of where we are at for the benefit of the panel, but also to try and really take sincere stock of where we are, right? So on the one hand, I hear loudly that the NPA is essentially incapacitated in the sense of resources. You simply don't have the human capital to do the work, right? And on the other hand, I hear you saying, well, a task force could be put up to reconsider, for example, the TRC's recommendations. That's fine. What I want to ask you, though, is, given the balance between the two versions, which are not contradictory, I understand fully what you're saying, do you think South Africa has right now the capacity to investigate institutions effectively for complex financial crimes?
Yeah. Every time you say something, you say, I've said, I worry. Did I really say? We have challenges. You know, you're right, that is what I'm saying. I'm saying, but you know, these are my former colleagues you're speaking about. I'm not saying there aren't pockets of excellence in the NPA with capacity to do this work. I'm saying as an institution, we are not the organization is not demonstrating that it is going to have the impact we all need it to have right now. Its record of prosecuting in this arena is dismal, and its explanations that it offers for why it has this problem doesn't lead one to believe that they're going to solve it anytime soon. You know, it's a very defensive stance. We are working on it, and you must give us time and you must give us space, and we can't disclose everything we're doing because we might compromise the investigation, but nothing happens for years and years, you know. I mean, Parliament is now really beginning to hold accountable. The parliamentary hearings in the last 2 years have been chalk and cheese from how they were in the past in terms of demanding that these institutions account for the resources that they are currently using to do their jobs. And so that's certainly one area where things are moving forward. You know, if the NPA came to Parliament, I believe now, saying, these are our challenges, and this is the legal framework, and within this legal framework, we propose to address our challenges in this and this way with your support, so which includes budgetary and financial support. And if you provide us with that support, we undertake and we commit to achieving the following. Certainly in the area I have the most experience in, asset forfeiture. And I think this is an issue that Parliament raised again recently. You can recover millions. The US recovers billions annually from the proceeds of crime and deploys those billions to fighting crime very successfully. Now, there are all sorts of issues, but there is no reason why a body can't say, we will recover 100 million in the next 2 years, because that's all it should take you, given how much is in the public domain has been looted, allegations of looting. There's no reason why that money shouldn't be able to come back. And if there's no reason why the NPA shouldn't be able to go to Parliament and say, to achieve this, this is what it's going to take. You provide us with these resources, and you can hold us accountable in the next 5 years for these outcomes. That's how it should work. That's how it works in other sectors. There is no reason why that shouldn't be the same in our prosecuting authorities. We know there are all sorts of other constraints, but we need to up the accountability ante. If we're giving money for prosecutions, then we must see prosecutions that have an impact. Does that help?
Yes, it does. No, I understand. And I admit, though, that you are in a very difficult position. I understand that. My last question to you is really a comment. Do you think that in the light of all the difficulties that you've highlighted, do you think whether there are opportunities in the law that we are missing to try and prosecute economic crimes? Would you want to speak to that a little?
Yes, absolutely. So as I bragged earlier, I was involved in the Sheikh recovery, and one of the prosecutions, one of the asset recovery matters I was involved in was trying to get money in Swiss bank accounts belonging to our as a result of our arms deal, post-94 arms deal investigation. And you'll all be familiar with the Fana Hlongwane investigation because it was reported widely on in the media. We, as Asset Forfeiture, had obtained a court order to seize assets belonging to Fana Hlongwane, both, especially because we had been alerted to assets sitting in bank accounts in Switzerland. And a High Court judge gave us an order saying that we could seize those assets. Mr. Hlongwane's formidable legal team then made representations to the then Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Menzi Simelani, who then thought that they were very sensible representations and instructed that the application be withdrawn. So, as far as I understand, actually the money is still sitting in Switzerland. So again, there are in several other cases money that international banks have seized because they are now obliged in terms of international money laundering laws to not act on. So they'll send notices here to South Africa to say, can you make a request and we will provide you with the information. And then the requests aren't forthcoming. So I think that my theme is whether it's pre-94, whether it's arms deal post-94, or whether it's right now, right? We have the legal framework to address these issues. We need to certainly set aside the resources to tackle them. We need to say that we are going to focus on these 3 areas. This is the resources required to make this a reality. These are the people we're going to put in charge, we're going to ring fence them, and we're going to have them account on how much money have you recovered, how many people have you had convicted. We have the legal framework. We have, so the NDPP's current complaint, and it's a fair complaint, that he has to wait for the police to investigate and refer cases. But there are provisions, both certainly in the Corruption Act, if you ask me to say the full name of the Corruption Act, I'm going to falter. So the Corruption Act does have provisions that allow for establishing joint investigation prosecution capacity to certainly recover the proceeds of corruption. So what's stopping us from activating that provision and say, so we're putting together a team of people, the best we have in the police, the best we have in the prosecution, and they must recover, let's say, arising out of the current state of capture report, X amount of money. And they must put together a budget and say, what's it going to take? So we know consciously what we're putting money into and what we're going to expect as a return. prosecutors obviously will come back and say, well, the law doesn't work like that. You know, it's not like a factory, you put in something and at the end you get a conviction. There are all sorts of issues along the way. But I think that when you have an accountability mechanism, when you say to them, we expect you to produce X million, they come back to you and they say, okay, we weren't able to make that target, but these are the reasons. And we all interrogate those reasons. And if the reasons are, we need more resources, okay, we attend to that. If the reason is, our law is not as clear and as watertight as we thought, so maybe it needs a legislative amendment, or if the person just wasn't guilty, we all accept, because we've given it our best shot to investigate and prosecute. But, you know, in the current system, we just have to wait and see they're working on something. You know, we don't have the kind of scrutiny that we absolutely need to have, because, like I said, we have the laws, we have the institutions, we have fallible human beings. So the next additional requirement is public accountability for the work that they're doing. And that is now happening in Parliament to some extent, and civil society has certainly gone to town in terms of trying to hold accountable. Prosecutions are being reviewed left, right, prosecution decisions are being reviewed left, right, and center. The conduct of the NPA is taken on review. So certainly civil society has been robust in a time of lull, you know, when we haven't had that much action emanating from the NPA. Civil society hasn't sat back and said, okay, well, what can we do? They've used the courts. And, you know, there are criticisms about that, but they've done something. Each of these on its own is not going to solve all our problems, but we strengthen each of these processes and we have a far better chance of achieving the kind of accountability we all are looking for.
I do have more questions, but I won't. Yeah, that's fine. The panel is going to ask you some questions now, and hopefully they will ask some of mine, because they. So.
Panel? You got anything? Okay.
Just a short question from me. So again, you draw a very bleak picture, which worries me. You spoke to a bit of global willingness, and I think from the testimonies we heard yesterday, we know how easily that perceived willingness can be eroded as well. But in my mind, I'm thinking of, is there a possibility of a civil society solidarity, whether at an international or local level, that can make use of whatever opportunity is there in the legal framework to persuade whether the international or national governance bodies to act on economic crimes of this nature?
Firstly, on the bleakness of the picture, I don't share the pessimism. I think we do have a moment, and I'm here because I am so excited about this intervention. Because I think what happens in all the African countries I've had exposure to is independence comes, we have fought so hard, some of us get taken up into government positions, and the rest of civil society sits back and waits for the government now to deliver, because it's people we trust, it's people we know, they fought the good fight. So then civil society just goes into retreat. And then it takes years to crank up that civil society machine, because civil society starts realizing, actually, we can't just sit back and allow governments to solve these problems for us. We have to remain active, we have to remain vigilant. And what's for me particularly encouraging about this forum is there's a sense that whenever you mention economic crime or financial investigations, everybody steps back to think, oh, we don't understand these things, we don't know how they work, they're so complex and they're so complicated. So what I appreciate about a forum like this is for us to unpack these issues. They are not capable, they are capable of being broken down and understood by all of us in terms of the impact they have and the manner in which they are being perpetrated on us. And the more we have these sorts of discussions, the more it's investigators with our level of skill and capacity who are going to have to investigate this. And the more we have public debates about what happened at Steinhoff, can somebody just explain to a layperson what is the issue there? Why have we lost billions and what exactly was corrupt about it? And it's our job as investigators and prosecutors to do that to a judge in a public forum where everybody can understand, so this is what they were doing, so that we can be vigilant in future about not allowing those kinds of things to happen again in future. So I'm very encouraged by civil society has played roles at many levels. It's taken things to court. So certainly you can't despair about civil society and civil society activism. And this is happening globally. In the Global Forum on Asset Recovery, happened in December last year, there were two fora happening, the Government's Forum and the Civil Society Forum. And civil society was there agitating on a number of issues and added to the recommendations that came out of the forum. So there's certainly a global recognition that civil society have as much a role and responsibility in fixing local problems and contributing to international agendas as they have at domestic levels. But on your issue of, I've lost track of where I was going. Just remind me
No, I think you've covered both sides of my question. So it was about solidarity of civil society internationally and nationally, and I think you've touched on that.
I just want to add the last point on civil society solidarity, for example. So my little pet issue about the appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions as a more watertight process that secures the independence of that office, and that it be a more public and rigorous process than currently is the case. We'd like to know before the National Director is appointed rather than after, when the decision is taken on review, what sort of person is being appointed. I think that is an issue that civil society should firmly place on the agenda and agitate for quite strongly. And it's those kinds of things that I think civil society has been very effective about campaigning for. Thank you.
Okay, I do have a few questions, unfortunately. The first one is this. In the early 1990s, when you first joined the prosecuting authority, was there an enthusiasm in the prosecution there was a clear understanding that I'm sure everyone had, that the violations of the United Nations arms embargo had happened, they were considerable, and they were responsible for continuing apartheid. Was there, at the beginning, a particular focus on ensuring that these violators who were responsible for supporting apartheid to such a considerable extent should be brought to book at that time?
So again, I was in the Asset Forfeiture Unit for the longest time, and certainly in that capacity, being in...
Well, it will apply to asset forfeiture too, because remember that there was lots of money which was a product of crime, millions and millions lying everywhere, arising out of the various firearms deals that went around, right?
Yes, no, and so So what I'm saying is I'm not aware of an official approach to specifically pre-1994 economic crime. But what did happen in various investigations, and certainly in various asset forfeiture investigations, and I'm sure you'll be familiar, Judge, with, say, the Rotenbach matter. These are all cases that went through the courts. Some of the role players certainly were facilitators that came up in the pre-1994 era. I'm loath to mention names, but several of them pop up in the book and I think Henny van Veer in his talk yesterday mentioned Breedenkamp, for example. He's certainly someone who has continued from in the previous era and currently to play a role in sort of underground facilitation of corruption. So there was certainly a sense in which these networks were still very much in place and were just having to deal with new principles. But, you know, and so maybe the color of the person has changed a bit, but the person had the power to give them what they want, and the person could be made susceptible to their tactics to get them to cooperate. So there was certainly a continuity and an attempt to address those people, but those people have been old hands at the game, and certainly I think they locate themselves. They were located in Zimbabwe last I checked. You know, so they have had sophisticated ways of evading, but you need a focus. You can't come across it while you're focusing on whether Hyundai paid or didn't pay tax for bringing in those vehicles back then, and what role did he play in that scheme of corruption. You need to focus on that as an issue, as well as focusing on what they currently facilitate.
So do I understand your answer rightly to mean that you are not aware of any particular focus within the National Prosecuting Authority to bring to book United Nations sanctions violators?
That's correct. That's correct.
The next issue is this. I was wondering why. Because it should have been in the forefront of everyone's mind. Could be a number of reasons. Could be lack of resources, but could also be a kind of understanding, because you rightly conceded that the politics of the day have some implications for how even an independent prosecuting authority does its work. Was there perhaps a milieu that we must now concentrate on reconciliation for the future, and that somehow digging into the past in this way and challenging large corporations and so on might well make those corporations a little bit uneager to contribute to reconstruction, and that perhaps digging into the past was inconsistent with the reconciliation that we wanted to achieve for the future. Was there some kind of thinking like that, or am I completely mistaken?
So if you're asking me to answer that question as a prosecutor in the NPA at the time, I certainly didn't get a clear line of march that focus only on current stuff, don't go back. But you know, there is current outcry in the media, let's say, about issue X. And then, you know, we focus on issue X because there's going to be some questioning and accountability. So I think without a policy or overt or covert policy that we should go forward and not look backward, that tends to happen in an organization if there isn't a conscious effort to say, we will address it. Like there has to be a conscious policy decision to address it, otherwise it won't be addressed. You will just move on to the next crisis. I imagine in the corridors of the NPA now, Steinhoff is being shouted all over the place, and everyone's forgetting about last week's major thing that we were so focused on. So unless the management of the organizations are saying, we are not going to be so fickle, we are going to isolate this issue, focus on it, address it, take it to its logical conclusion. We'll have maybe another unit look at this. So I cannot say that there was a conscious policy one way or the other. And I think what I'm saying between the lines then is probably there should have been a conscious policy look at that, because it comes up in all sorts of ways. And I think the book for me was very revealing, not just because I was involved in many investigations and often didn't have the time or the luxury to think, how do these things connect with the past? And having them laid out like that in a nice continuity, I think was incredibly useful. And I think now even warrants a little project to say, can we understand how these things work? Because a lot of those things are coming back to bite us now in the financial scandals that are hitting us.
That brings me to the next question. Do you agree that corruption, although corruption is a speciality, international crime requires, to a large degree, different expertise because it's a different speciality. And unless you have experts to manage that within the prosecution service and within the police as divisions, specifically concentrating on it, it will be very difficult to develop that expertise because it is so specialized.
I think that what you need is focus more than expertise, because expertise can be developed. But if a group of prosecutors are running helter-skelter every day, they're never going to become sufficiently familiar with how do I make a mutual legal assistance request. Or they spend an inordinate amount of time figuring it out, and then they go off and do something completely different, and then that expertise, the next person must come and learn again. So partly I think we need dedication and focus. And then, of course, I mean, at the moment, prosecutors and investigators are being trained left, right, and center, because often in these conventions, UN Convention on Corruption or OECD conventions, one of the easiest boxes to tick is, have you trained prosecutors or investigators? So prosecutors and investigators spend a lot of time being trained on these things and a whole lot less time actually trying to do them because they are carrying many dockets, they're running in there. Their organization isn't set up to say, can you just focus on this? Tell us how long it's going to take for you from beginning to end to come out with a conclusion, and then can you go and do it now?
To your knowledge, is there a division within the prosecution service specifically dedicated to international crime? There is.
I hesitate to say, because there's that special commission looking at the Rome Statute in the prosecution. I'm not exactly sure what the mandate is, the PSU. But and in the police there certainly isn't, but that would be partly because the definition of international crime. If you said, is there a group of people looking at corruption, whether it's domestic or crosses borders, because most corruption these days, corruption investigation is inevitably a cross-border investigation because money flows. So you don't just need ability to ask for bank statements from a bank abroad. You need accounting skills, basic accounting skills to understand how the money is flowing this way and that. So you need to create pockets of expertise where people understand financial investigation. Technically, we have the commercial crime, the special commercial crime unit in the police, as well as the SSCU, the special commercial crimes prosecution body. And they too went to Parliament and accounted for what they're doing. So a special commercial crime unit should not be taking plea bargains when nobody goes to jail, because what's special about that? You know, I mean, if you're going to classify someone stealing from me a couple of, even million now, as a special commercial crime that requires special resources, then it must result in a prosecution and some jail time and some recovery of big money. It can't just be a plea bargain, slap on the wrist and maybe pay something, you know. So we don't have bodies who are forced to focus on the bigger cases and forced to produce results and develop expertise. We had it starting in the Scorpions, and it certainly was becoming fairly effective, and learning as we were going along there what was needed. But as we know, that came to a abrupt halt. Certainly, going back to that model of investigators, prosecutors, accountants, working on a defined scope of crime, and showing results that are not just plea bargains, slap on the wrist, don't go to jail.
And there's no course available at any university, as I remember it, on international, the prosecution of international criminal law crime.
I'm not aware, but in criminal law cases now I see increasingly the UK Bribery Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and the international instruments forming part of the curriculum. Also, there are these courses for investigators who are investigating cross-border financial flows. So there is expertise being developed, and as I said, there's lots of training products that the UN, ODC, and various other bodies. The US makes so much money from the proceeds of crime that they have an enormous budget to spend on training people on cross-border corruption because it's funded from the proceeds of crime. So there's certainly no shortage of training available for people, but it's making those people sit in an institutional setting where they can now focus on these kinds of cases that they have had the training to do and just deliver results.
I only have two more questions. One of these is it, you know that the Constitution provides that any accused person is entitled to a trial within a reasonable time. What's your opinion on whether pre-1994 UN violators can be prosecuted now on the basis that they'd obviously take the defense that the crimes were committed more than 25 years ago, and therefore a reasonable time has expired, and you're unfair to prosecute us now. It is unconstitutional. What's your opinion on that?
That's obviously a constraint in prosecuting them, but my experience, training, and orientation is in recovering the money. And there's certainly far fewer constraints on achieving accountability for paying back the money, because it doesn't infringe liberty and all sorts of other.
So I'm sorry, your response leads me to another question, which is a hypothetical. If you were the National Director of Public Prosecutions, would you make a policy decision to prosecute those people before 1994 and let the court decide whether the time is reasonable, or would you leave it?
What I would do is I would look at, because it has to produce results. It can't just be people like Henny and others do a very good job of the research into, they've done a very good job of where the issues are. I would take that as a point of departure, look at who's still alive, who is still in the pound seats, handsomely benefiting from the wrongs they did back then, and then look for legal opportunities to recover from them. And by and large, you will find that they are still at it today. If they did it successfully then without accountability, they are still doing it today. And you may not take them for offenses committed then, but you certainly can broaden the scope of recovering from them. So you can't, I almost think, in light of what we have going on in the country at the moment, delve into an offense that happened there where the perpetrator is either dead or fast approaching that inevitability. And then your result is that we know more now, but we haven't been able to get any accountability. You have to actually, part of the terms of reference must be there is scope for accountability. Whether that is simply recovering assets at this point in time. There's just one thing I want to mention before I forget. But there's been and I know members of the panel may be more familiar with this, but there was also recently the Iraq sanctions, and and there were people who were busting sanctions in terms of the oil embargo. And I didn't have much proximity to that investigation, but there certainly seemed a lot of scope to hold people accountable for money made from sanctions busting. So certainly, I would look into that and see how successful they were in recovering from big corporations who, it's almost exactly the same scenario, making money off an embargo in a particular trade, and actually making fantastic profits because you don't have the constraints that other people have of following the law. So that is certainly an area to look at remedies and methods of holding people accountable.
And the last question, unless there's a follow-up, is this, that you talked about the manner of appointment of the National Director of Public Prosecutions. Most people make that criticism on the understanding that the President makes the appointment on her or his own. The position, constitutionally speaking, is that the Cabinet does so. Is your understanding, your criticism of the manner of appointment based on the first understanding that the President does it on his or her own, or is it based on the second understanding that Cabinet does so?
It's based on the understanding that it's exclusively in the domain of politicians to make the appointment.
So it doesn't matter as far as you're concerned?
It doesn't matter, and I think it won't even matter if we extend it to just Parliament, because it will still be politicians. I think to enhance the independence of the institution, and for the institutional head to appreciate that you don't just account to politicians, you account to the public more broadly, and even the legal fraternity, whatever that may mean. But that, firstly, it's a public process. So the person has to publicly put themselves up there for appointment. We do it to judges, much to judges' discomfort and annoyance. It's far more important to do it with this quasi-judicial appointment. It sits between the executive and the judiciary, and so it should be appointed by a combination of the two, so that the incumbent always appreciates that I serve many constitutions, obviously first and foremost the Constitution, but I'm accountable to not the incumbent politicians who I may or may not have to investigate and prosecute.
I'm sorry I kept you for so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. Member.
Is that the end of the session? So can we now go and eat, you think?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's go. Thank you. Oh, okay. So thank you very much. I think we've thanked you already all together, but let's do it publicly. Thank you. You have done a very important job of work for this process. And may I just say that you are one of the few people who do the legal profession proud.